Welcome to The Why with James Hsu. This is a show where I sit down with a guest to explore their why, what drives amazing people to do amazing things. Today's episode is with Stephenie Lee. Stephenie is the founder of Beacon Learning, an education startup focused on strengthening the learning and social skills of kids with special needs. We talk about spirituality, career development, running a company, and dealing with life's highs and lows. Enjoy. Stephenie Lee, how are you doing today?
I'm good, thanks. Off of a trip from Turkey, so I'm like pretty jet lagged, but you know, good otherwise.
Yeah, how was the Turkey trip?
Amazing. I first of all went with the most perfect human, one of my classmates from college, and because of COVID and kind of other personal reasons, I like haven't been back to the States in a really long time, and so it was just amazing to go on a trip with someone. And we were just talking about how like I think some of the people that you become friends with at really pivotal times in your life, like that relationship is so strong that you can not see them for like 6 or 7 years, right? And then you see them and you just go right back to where you were before.
As if it was yesterday kind of deal, right?
Yeah, I mean, and it's crazy because a lot of things have happened in our respective lives. But it really, we were saying that it felt like we were just away for like a semester. One of us had gone and studied abroad and now we're back again. Um, that was the feeling we had. So it was really the best.
Was this also the first time you've been to Turkey or it's a repeat visit?
It was my first time and I loved Turkey. So I'm not a spiritual person, like I'm not religious. But throughout my life, I think I've dabbled in various religions. Like I don't know if you guys had this in Canada, but in Asian communities in the US, I think if you move around a lot of times you go to churches and things like that as a way to have a first community when you go to a city because like a lot of churches are kind of clustered by cultural background anyway. So like the Chinese church thing, are you familiar with that? Or like the
I
Korean
grew
church?
up I grew up Catholic, so I did the whole 9 yards. Like I was an altar boy for like over a decade. I was like baptized, confirmed, youth group, retreats, the whole 9 yards. Yeah, that was me.
Oh, interesting. At some
Yeah.
point, I really want to hear about how that impacted you and the way that you are. Yeah,
Maybe not always for the better, I think.
yeah, no, but that's so interesting. Because I've known a couple of like really devout individuals, really thoughtful people who were raised in a very devout environment. And I've always been really interested in the way that they, over time, challenge and come back to, and then challenge and come back to, or redefine and use new terminology to kind of understand faith and beliefs and spirituality and purpose. I think is really different in religions as well. Um, but anyway, yeah. So I definitely want to hear more about that. Like my first boss, who I really respect in many many ways, uh, was raised Muslim and then had a long period in his life when he questioned these things and explored other religions and things like that, and then went back. But anyway, so Turkey um, was such a spiritual place and it has so much history. And it's so interesting to have this, um, to learn about the history of the way that Islamic faith and like ruling a territory, like geographical um, um, definition of like power, right, can come in and be embodied in the same person at certain points in his history. And then at certain points, it's not, right? At certain points, like Christianity and Judaism and Islam all existed in that area. And then like, so I think the way that its culture and its religions kind of have flowed and the story of that place is just really phenomenal and is so loaded with history compared to America. So
Yeah, you're just I have to imagine I have not been to Turkey, but I also really want to go. I feel like if you are there, you're just like walking on history. You're just wherever you go, you're just feeling it around you, right? There's just and along with that the spirituality as you mentioned.
and evolving history. Like one of the things that I really loved is mosques are so frequently used. Like they're used 5 times a day, right, for prayer. And then in the middle, like I was really pleased to see, people also go there to just hang out because they're basically like public squares. And so I just met some locals while I was waiting for my friend, for example, when we parted ways and things like that, where it was just an amazing um, thing to be like. I think when I visited Europe and I went to a lot of churches, like churches on the weekdays are basically just tour sites, right? Like,
Hmm.
I'm not Christian, and so I don't go on the weekends. But you really get this feeling that so much of the way that these buildings are maintained or the area around it is like built and designed is for the purpose of tourism and visitors and like maintaining the past, versus for me, like it was so cool to see the way that like really devout practitioners still are going to like the Hagia Sophia or still are going to the new mosque to practice, because there is legend and tradition and ritual there that says that praying there has some specific benefits, but then they just need to pray anyway, right? And so like if you live in Istanbul, why would you not like go to these very like amazing spiritual places to pray? Like being just in one of the squares and listening to the prayer call is, I mean, yeah. Like I was talking to some friends last night and just saying that maybe two of the most religious experiences I've had. One was like the Sagrada Familia in Barcelona, and I think that truly is like a feat of architectural and artistic design in terms of the way that you feel closer to God, literally, when you walk through and the light and it does its magic. But then the other one I think would be this time in Turkey, where I was just like, I'm living in an evolving kind of religious space
Hmm.
right now, like even if
Hmm.
just for a few days. It's beautiful.
Yeah. And how are folks doing in Turkey? I mean, in terms of just the aftermath of the earthquake, and I've heard so much about that, although I've not been on the ground as you have. Like, has that what's the mood or what's the tenor like these days? Is it everything back to normal? People moving on and
So we went to Istanbul and Cappadocia, and I think unfortunately both places are really heavily funded by tourism. And so, I don't think it really reflects the bulk of maybe what is happening in other places in Turkey. The one thing I will say is there's a ton of inflation in Turkey right now. And I've never visited a place when there is so much inflation. And so, like, to me, it was, I've learned about it in textbooks, right? Like, I've learned about places that are very volatile. And you'll go to a restaurant and you'll see clearly that prices have been taped over several times recently. Because, like,
oh,
those little white, like, prices that like restaurants and menus and things like that. So you'll really see that. And then you also have conversations with people, and they're like, yeah, before a cab ride to the airport, it was this many liras, but gas prices have actually like um between doubled and tripled in the past like 2 weeks. So, they
wow.
have to charge more. And you can get the sense that euros and US dollars are much preferred over liras. Like almost every vendor, including
Much more
at the,
stable, obviously.
yeah, but they're quoting in euros and US dollars, and as a way to guide you or nudge you in the direction of paying in those denominations. And
Mm.
so like all of these things I learned in a textbook way once upon a time, and it was pretty amazing to feel it. Um, to even feel in the course of like the 8 days that we were there that maybe we should have brought more cash and exchanged it at different points in time, or maybe we shouldn't take a bunch of money out on our first day, but rather spread that out across the days, just because inflation is really like even impacting exchange rates, right? So never personally experienced that, but did this time.
Yeah. So, taking a bit of a segue or a step back, set it up for us. Like, who is Stephenie Lee? You mentioned, of course, you're from the US. I think you're Taiwanese American, right? Or Chinese American, as we say in China. Set it up for us. Like, where are you from? What's your background? Just yeah, just all that kind of stuff.
I'm Taiwanese American. I was born and raised in New Orleans, but I've kind of lived all over in the US, in that I went to college in the Northeast and then stayed out there and lived and worked out there for a couple of years, and then lived in the Bay Area before I moved to China about 6.5. Ugh, wow, happened in a flash, but like six and a half
Time
years ago.
flies.
Yeah, it just happened. And I work in education. I have been in kind of brick and mortar education ever since I graduated from college, with a very short foray working in really big nonprofits, basically, because at one point I thought I would be interested in doing fundraising. But since then, I've basically been in education, mostly in brick and mortar. There was also a small period of time, like, well, 2.5 years, which I guess isn't that small, when I did ed tech in China mostly. And yeah, should I cover anything else?
What is it about education? Like, what was the draw, and what continues to be the draw for you?
Oh, that's a good question. Um, so so I actually feel like I have always been a little bit involved in education. My parents are educators. My dad's a professor. My mom was also like an adjunct professor, and things like that. And I think I didn't even think of it as a career because I didn't really want to be like my parents. Um, but I've kind of always done it. Like I've always like tutored other people or did mentoring programs and things like that. And some of my most formative experiences in college had to do with this one program that helped um, Asian kids in the Upper Valley, which is a really homogenous area that's mostly white, um, or mostly Caucasian, uh, adjust and basically have role models who looked Asian because their environment like was had such high contrast. Like a lot of the kids that we worked with either were like the only Asian family in their community, or they were adopted into a Caucasian family and then lived in a predominantly like white community. And so that was like a really mentoring heavy piece where it was just about like ensuring that kids had like more points of reference, right, for Asians. And then the other program that I really loved was a program called FICEP, which supported first generation college students who were coming to Dartmouth, which is the college I attended, and helped them to bridge into their college experience better, because frankly speaking, I think there's not enough credit given to how much of a role parents play in easing a child into their college experience. Like there's just so much um like my parents went to college, but they did so in Taiwan, right? So their expectations, how they set me up for college, made me feel like a first generation college student, but obviously I'm not. And then I would look at other of my peers whose parents went to college in the US, right? And they were really well set up. And then I would look at others whose parents went to Dartmouth, and my God, like they just knew about like what extracurricular activities existed. They knew about what resources existed if they had trouble. They felt, I mean, I don't think that they had as much imposter syndrome, right? Like I went there and I was like, if I struggle, I don't know where to go. And like, is it weakness if I go to the writing center and ask for help? Like, is it weakness if I'm going to a lot of office hours? Like, I think, yeah, each additional layer of like familiarity that kids had with their college experience, I think actually is a huge, huge asset as you navigate college. And so that was like another mentoring program that I did, that was really important to me when I was in college. We academically prepared students, but we also kind of, I think, like emotionally and extracurricularly prepared students for their experience. And then I also did some tutoring for underprivileged kids and things like that. But anyway, I graduated studying art history, and like art history really opened doors for me in terms of like my interest in learning, and feeling really kind of like personally driven to explore topics and things like that. And so I didn't think I was going to become an artist, but I was like, I can fundraise for the arts because I am chatty and, like I'm reasonably articulate or whatever. As it turns out, I'm really not cut out for entry level fundraising. And so I started tutoring on this side. Like my partner at the time basically was like, Steph, you're miserable. Like you really don't like your 9 to 5. Like if for no other reason of just feeling more alive again, right, and more connected, you should tutor on the side. So I tutored on the side, got really lucky. The company that I was tutoring for, I think, had a desire to really revolutionize how we think about tutoring as an opportunity to, on a one-on-one basis, personalize the learning experience of kids and to think kind of from a neuroscience perspective of how recent research can be applied to the uniqueness of kids' learning profiles to more scientifically say, these are the programs that are best fit for you. And in this combination, so that your learning experience is actually the most efficient. And I think intellectually, that kind of desire to be more scientific was interesting to me. But I don't think it's right until you feel something different. And the way that I felt was like I would do my 9 to 5, and then I would take the train for like 45 minutes to an hour to get to a student. And then I would work with him, and he was really interesting. He was like an English language learner and also had various learning differences. So I would work with him, and then I'd get out, and on my train back, I would spend like an hour to an hour and a half calling the chief academic officer of my company, because we were a small company at the time, and calling her and just like being like, this is what I noticed today. Like, what's going on? What do you think? Right? Like, I was just so personally driven because like at that point, I'm on the train from 5 to 6. I do a session from like 6 to 8. So I'm like calling this person at 8 o'clock and sometimes talking to like 10 or 11 just about this kid, right? And I was just like so engaged. And then I got more and more kids, and I started to do screenings and assessments, and I just loved it. I mean, like, I think one of the things I feel luckiest about is finding that joy early enough, so that I think right now, even if I don't have any financial reasons to be working, this would be something that I would want to work in. And I know that. And it makes some career decisions in my life easier to make because it's okay if my company moves slowly, because I think even if I were doing it on my own, I'd do it, So it's not a question of whether or not I do it. It's just a question of like, in what way am I doing it? That has the most impact, but is also the most sustainable for my life. So yeah, since then, I mean, education continues to be something, because we work on a very personal basis, that I think just involves endless exploration. Like almost at any given time, I have a new kid that I'm just like, what is happening? Like, man, I really need to read more articles, read more books, like just like learn a lot more, maybe take more classes so that I'm better equipped for kids that are like this. So, I mean, I feel lucky because I'm driven and compelled in that way by the work that I do. And the way that I'm doing it is in such an up close and personal setting that, yeah, I could in 1 month be reading about your visual system and how scientists were able to figure out that you had a proprioception system, or like a sense of body and space, that is absent of your vision. And on another month, I could be reading about, the way that when you have a new baby and you swaddle them and you coo at them, like what systems in your body that's connected to and why it actually works. Or, in another month, I could be learning about kids who really struggle with math and how their sense of body and space impacts their math learning abilities. Like, that's kind of what keeps it fresh and what keeps it awesome, and what also keeps me knowing that I'm still interested.
Is there any kind of perspective or advice you might give to people about how they can find what's fresh and awesome for themselves? Like, I'm just wondering, as someone who is so learned and academic in some ways, like, is there some sort of framework for how people might find that if they're feeling lost?
Well, one of my experiments in entrepreneurship was actually in career coaching. So there are a lot of frameworks out there for thinking about, finding the intersection of like your competency and your passion and interests, and then finding like the workplace environment or the culture that is a good fit. And I do think it tends to be those pieces. Um, but I think like, so I think like people should be data driven about their intuition about a job. So I think like you can't help what feelings that you get, but I think you should track what feelings you get about your work, and you should try to understand what about this workplace is working and what about it isn't working. So I think a lot of people don't start thinking about their work this way until they're ready to quit. And for a lot of people at that point, there's nothing good about this workplace, right? They're so sick of it that there is nothing redeemable about it. And I think that means that this experience or this experiment that you did in your life, like you invested a year or 2 years or 5 years or whatever in an experiment, you're not getting as much feedback from it to help guide your next experiment. And so, like, I actually think it's a really good practice for people to reflect on a regular basis and even be a little bit data driven about tracking, what felt good about it, so that they can glean the most possible from every single work experience to say, like, how close or how far am I from this thing that feels right? And then, and then,
Sorry, can you give an example of data driven? Because I'm trying to reconcile what you said about data driven versus intuition, right? Like, what does it mean to be data driven in this sense? Am I tracking like the things that I'm doing? Am I tracking my mood or sentiment? Like, what? Can you give some examples here?
I think it's helpful to track your mood and sentiment around what success felt like in this experience, or like what gave you a sense of fulfillment on a daily basis, or like on a weekly basis at least, right? Because I think some workplaces will teach you what it feels like to be working with a manager that really fits your style. Some workplaces will teach you what it feels like to have like a workplace culture that is not kind of counterproductively competitive, but like people are really collaborative. Some places will teach you what it feels like to have a problem you think is really worth solving, right? And then linked to that will be these feelings of like, today's a good day, And then why was it a good day? Oh, it's because I had a feedback meeting with my manager, and the way that my manager gave me feedback helped me feel respected without being fluffy. And
Mm-hmm.
I think that's taught me something about the kind of person I want managing me and helping me grow. Or like, oh, like today felt like a really productive day, right? Which is a form of goodness. And like, why did it feel productive? Oh, because I was able to like go down a rabbit hole for like an hour and a half on this thing that I really have found myself caring more and more about. And that's like a really good feeling for me. So I think that's helpful as you are continuing to feel maybe more jaded or more ready for your next move, to provide yourself with some evidence of like, what did I learn from this past, and like, what do I want to carry on to my next thing? And
Mm.
otherwise, I think some people make really dramatic changes without enough data, or they make really safe decisions because they, again, don't have any data, right? Like, it's always easiest to get a job that's really similar to your current job. And so if you don't have some clarity around what you're looking for, it's pretty easy to just be like, I just need a switch. And like, I'm just going to find another job. The easiest one for me to find is one that's really, really similar. And then on the other hand, you have the people who are like really unhappy. They're willing to even quit without a job, or they're willing to, you know, look for jobs that are just like 180-degree turns. And the reason part of the reason that they do that, again, is because they're like done with the possibility even reflecting on their past experience, and they don't know what they're experimenting with for this next job. So they're just like really kind of, looking for a big change. And I mean, I don't think any of these options are wrong, right? I just think like it may then take you longer to find to figure out what those qualities that you're looking for as you switch jobs in the future if you're not as reflective.
So it sounds like being reflective or introspective is a key ingredient to that. And I'm wondering how I do have a sense that a lot of folks who work or have a 9 to 5, they're kind of in a state of, or they've developed a state of cynicism about everything, where it's just, for most people, I think, in the world, it's just, I'm clocking in, and they don't feel all that attached to, not that I'm saying everyone should be, but I'm wondering if like what you described where people don't introspect is also, could it be a contributing factor to like people being in a state of malaise, or as in China they call lying flat, 躺平, or something like that. Is there any kind of correlation here, you think? It's kind of a leading question, but yeah, I'm just curious as to your thoughts.
I mean, I think there are a lot of people who I think there are a lot of people who like at least need job to fulfill their financial needs, right? So like if for no other reason you have to do at least that. And I think as you get jaded and disillusioned, I think it's like a little bit of a vicious loop with the tongue ping thing, right? It's like at very minimum you need to pay your bills, and so you're there, and then like it's you're feeling disenfranchised, you're feeling unproductive, you're feeling disengaged, and then it just becomes this like negative spiral of like, well, I mean, a lot of people when they're in that 躺平状态, they're basically like trying to game the system, right? They're going to be like, I just don't want to be on the bottom of like the quarterly rankings, and so
Yeah.
like what is just enough, and like they're starting to calculate, they're spending more energy calculating the probability of getting promotion. That probability is not really very high, then might as well not work too hard, right? Like I mean, I think we've all talked to people who have entered
Mm.
that mode where like the bulk of their energy is not actually on work anymore. The bulk of their energy is on like unnecessary.
Stasis, or figuring out how not to be in the bottom,
Yeah, how not to be
at
at
the
the
bottom.
bottom, what's their probability of moving ahead? And then in our world today, very unlike, I think, like maybe 4 or 5 decades ago, people don't expect to stay at the company for very long, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like people think about upward movement actually as moving companies and then getting a raise, right? Or moving companies and then moving up in the like zhiji or the like professional levels. And so if you think about it that way, then like there is a bunch of people who are kind of in a limbo period at work. They're doing these calculations a lot. They are trying to figure out whether or not it makes sense for them to put in more effort. Frankly speaking, I just think you spend so much time at work, right? Like you spend like minimum 7, 8 hours at work every day, 5 days a week at least. And then in China, what's worse is that you could be spending 10 to 14 hours a day, maybe 6 days, 7 days a week. And so to be in that 躺平状态for that long, I think that's just a shame. That's just under optimization of like human life. So I think that is one case. I think the other case is that like for some people, your life priorities just shift. And in fact, I think that's a little bit of what I'm going through. So I think when you start to have a family, when your parents age and they start to get sick, when kind of big things in your life happen that necessitate you shifting your priorities, then work may also become just work, right? Like, I think work is something most people expect to spend a lot of time in. So I think it ought to have purpose. But at the same time, I think one of the biggest things my dad having Alzheimer's has taught our family is like, you can be incredibly successful in your career, but at the end of life, somehow it's still your personal relationships. Even if he was like a super absentee dad, like somehow now that is still the center of his world. And so I think, uh, yeah, sometimes it's just your life priorities shift, and then it causes you to make work a smaller percentage of your energy. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that, but I think that is oftentimes what happens.
Hmm. Talk to me also about how all of that lies in relation to running a company, because like you mentioned a couple of things. For example, as an employee, what are some things that um, make you feel engaged, or like when people introspect, like I had a great conversation with my manager, I had, like, there are good reasons, compelling reason for me to feel like there's some, I'm bringing value to what I'm doing. um I would love for you to talk about like how that is juxtaposed with, like, now you're in the position of, you're running a company, you're a leader, so you're trying to instill these values. Like, are you taking everything of what you've experienced in the past as an employee and applying that in the proper ways? Like, what would you say the challenges are here?
No, I don't think I am. I mean, I think, um, yeah, I think running a company is really challenging and it's a grind and it takes a long time. And I think people are really dynamic. So it's one of the hardest things, I think, to get right on a consistent basis. I've never, been CEO of a big company, so I don't know if, like, with scale and with the ability to hire more people and like putting the right people in place, this part gets easier. But certainly when you're small, I think one of the hardest things is like you're kind of on all fronts doing things. And I think it is fair to have expectations of employees, but you have expectations of employees that you try to be explicit about, and then you are experimenting with whether or not your management practices and your hiring practices work, right? So I think maybe there are two big pieces. Like, one is like the hiring of people and constructing of culture, and then I think the other piece is maybe like how you steward um, these employees. And I think, hmm, so I think like I've always found myself very successful at managing people, both at helping people become more of an expert and more of a professional in the domain that we're working in, but also in helping us achieve pretty audacious goals for ourselves. Um, and one of the things that I've recently been reflecting a lot about on is like why that doesn't feel to have been as successful in my current company. And
Mm.
um, yeah. So when I think about it in the past, some of it has to do with the fact that um, I think uh, when I hired people in the past, a lot of times I'm hiring people who um, are in the point in their lives where they're looking for a challenge. Like the sometimes they're fresh graduates hungry to learn, right? They have no expectations for what the workplace looks like. But they are really, if you throw a challenge at them, they just think they're supposed to rise to that challenge. And so they'll stumble their way through it. But if you're willing to coach and guide, then they actually all grow really fast.
Hmm.
And they're able to rise to that challenge. And then some of my teams in China, they've actually a lot of times consisted of people who thought that they were now and had now entered the part of their lives where they're tongue peeing. So
Mm.
they feel like they're like kind of middle aged and they should just do everyday work. But then you pose a challenge to them, you give them this feeling of empowerment, and they're able to rise again. They're like, and I've always been really impressed to see people who are jaded in the past because of, I think, management styles come
Hmm.
out feeling really empowered. Like, yeah. So I think in some ways it's the people that you have on your hand and on your team. And then on the other side is how you steward it. So I'm someone who I think um, tries to set pretty audacious goals traditionally, and even now to a certain extent. And then I try to really uh, create an environment where mistakes are okay. Like mistakes are
Hmm.
something that will work together and take as learning opportunities and will grow from it, right? So like I don't think anyone has to fear making a mistake. I also kind of try to challenge people where they are. So I think um give as much support as is possible, so that they can continue to like push themselves and to grow. But also give them as much support as they need so they don't feel like they're in free fall.
Mm.
Uh, and then I really tried to connect people to the purpose. So I think for me, like you're never really going to get the best output from a team member just because you pay them a little bit more. Like you shouldn't pay under market, right? But you're not going to get the best performance or even better performance just because you're like, this is what on an ongoing basis. And so I think we always try to pay fair, but then we also really try to help people understand the purpose of what we're doing. And in education, it happens to be pretty easy, right? So, like, if you find the people who, in their heart, are just also looking for the platform upon which they can make a difference through education, when you hire, then you're just stoking that fire the whole way. You're helping them
Hmm.
see on a daily basis how their actions and how their contributions are really making an impact there. Yeah. So as I've told you before in our personal conversations, James, like there's something unsuccessful about the way that I'm doing it now. And I can't quite figure it out. So I wish I could be like a lot more articulate. It's really not for lack of reflection or lack of time spent thinking about this topic. It's just that I haven't figured out why. But right now, I think I'm in a position where the culture where I'm in a position where I've changed, right? So I think I'm in a
Mm.
position where work isn't the principal and only focus. Like I definitely also spend quite a bit of energy thinking about my family and how my family's doing. I spend quite a bit of energy thinking about my personal relationships and like wanting to have a family. Yeah. And that like trying to have kids and trying to have a partner and trying to have good solid friendships, and then my health, like making sure that I work out, making sure that I, for example, you know, do TCM, like acupuncture and things like that, making sure that I sleep enough and things like that. So all of these actually take up a ton of time, way more time than I used to allocate to anything besides work. I mean, I used to really be quite a workaholic. And so I think I have to say I've changed, and I think um, I want to think that I'm modeling a way to balance all of these things and have strong performance and work. But I think there I failed, right? I must have failed because I think for my team members, in many ways, sometimes I think the love of the work that we do, the impact that we're making on families is really clear. But the desire to do all the things that build the ecosystem for us to continue to do this on a more and more sustainable basis and to serve more and more people to kind of follow me in that journey and to stay with me in that journey seems not to be in place. So I don't know. I think like for example, if you had talked to me 2 years ago, I would really confidently say, because all of my experience in the past have been like just different than how I feel right now. All my experiences in the past have felt like I am an epic manager. Like I really know how to paint that pie. I really know how to motivate people. I'm a really good role model. I'm a strong communicator. I'm not very present, which allows me to not micromanage. But whenever people need me, I think I give people a lot of space to try things and feel empowered, and then to reflect on it so that we know how to do better for next time. Because I know people already feel bad when they mess up. So my goal is never to like make you feel worse, but to instead like help them kind of move forward, right? So anyway, like I can't, I have reflected on a lot. I don't know that I have like one full packaged answer yet for it, but yeah, for sure. In the past, I would say I know. Now I feel a little bit less certain about it, but it's just a journey and it's a discovery. So I'm still working on it.
Yeah, it's just life, right? Just life changes us and our lens through which we perceive things around us. And the one thing I always have to also keep in mind, and we talked about this a bit before the recording, is also just the macro environment. Like, just living under COVID in China for the last 2 years, like, I know it's totally messed me up. Like, it's totally changed how I think about a lot of things. And I think you were mentioning too, like, for your team and people around you, like, it's also people's priorities have changed. So, like, just trying to stay afloat while all of it is happening as a manager, as a leader, as a owner of a business, it's just not that easy. I just yeah, I mean, it's hard, right? It's just people
Well, I think,
change.
I think there's an instinct to resist change because I think not changing provides stability. And so, and then I think when you like are managing a team or running a business, you resist other people changing because it introduces so much unpredictability to the way that you've planned things, right?
You feel less in control, basically.
Yeah, I mean, I think like every person who's in upper management who is running their own business, right? They make plans about the future based on the present. And so I really think like one of the things I continue to need to do is check in with what changes are good and okay, and like how can I empathize with the choices that other people are making and just support them, right? Like, in fact, if you're willing to have worked with this person once, you probably are willing to work with them again. I'm the kind of person who really does not like to part on bad terms. Like, I really think, be it with partners or friends or coworkers and like employees, it's kind of like, of course, there are plenty of misalignments or like changes in goals, changes in purpose that happen that cause you to not be as close or cause you to need to like depart from each other. But I think what's really critical to remember is that, we make decisions based on what we know are available and possible at this moment, right? And I want to be happy for the people around me because I chose to have them be in my life in really significant ways. So there are lots of redeeming qualities about these people. Yes, I am temporarily and momentarily disappointed right now, but even that they have been this deeply involved in my life in these ways, like, means that there are lots of qualities that means that if fate or if circumstance allows us to be involved in each other's lives, like if they want to come back to the company for the most part, I think that is something that I want to keep open. And of course, like, I truly want what's best for people around me. I don't think they're going to do their best work if they don't have good personal reasons to stay, right? I recently had a conversation with someone who wanted to leave, and like, you can feel that people, when they want to leave my companies or my teams, feel bad. And I was like, you really don't have to feel bad. Like, feeling bad is not what's going to make you want to stay anyway. Like, I do want you to stay. So let me outline the reasons why I think you should stay. Like, what this role could continue to offer you that could add value to you, right? I don't want you to make a sacrifice in staying. I don't want you to feel bad for our company and then stay either. Like those aren't the reasons to do it. I want you to do this because this is the right move for you. And if you think about it and it's not the right move for you, then that's okay, right? Like I need to process my emotions. I need to process the fact that this has an impact on my plans that I've made. But like, I'm not trying to guilt trip anyone into staying. And I've actually been guilt tripped before into staying to do things, and it hasn't ended well, right? Like at the end of the day, you regret it and you kind of resent people for it, and that's just not right. It's not right.
Yeah, I mean, life is just a series of calibrations. We try to figure out what has been done to us or around us, and then we try to pay it forward, if you want to say it optimistically, or try to apply it in the right ways. And nobody gets it perfect, but it's just something. It's just a never-ending thing. And I would just say, going back to what you said just a while back, like I don't think, just knowing you, I don't think it's like you were a better manager or worse manager 2 years ago. You just are who you are, and most of the time we just try to be consistent. And it sounds fatalist to say, but just let the chips fall where they may, because you're just trying to do what you think needs to be done, and people just react to things differently. So it's just that's just how it is, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think I would just say that I probably felt like a more confident manager. Like now I feel a lot of self-doubt. I don't think it's a bad thing. I think if I, find the time and space and energy to match that self-doubt with reflection, I actually think this is an opportunity. But it doesn't change the fact that it feels like crap sometimes. And sometimes I'm just like, well, maybe I'm different. Maybe I'm worse. Maybe I should go back to working in a company because actually I thrived there. So like, I don't know why I did this anyway, right? Like it doesn't change the fact that that voice is in your head. And like,
yeah, for sure. Sometimes you're just in the mud, or you're just in this period where it's mentally tough, for sure.
Yeah.
I want to switch gears a little bit, and I want to talk about also just, it's actually a good switch, because like just talking about how I think this idea that we're supposed to be at a certain point in our lives, especially when we try to benchmark ourselves against societal norms or friends and family or folks around us. I think this is something that you've struggled with, right? Or maybe you are going through it now. Like, can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah. Well, so I think when you're younger, like you're so benchmarked against your peers, right? Like you go through elementary school and like most people graduate, middle school, high school, and you go to college. Most people go to
Yeah.
college. And then
And
like,
when you're in Dartmouth, like literally you're probably benchmarked against the other students, right? In some shape or
yeah,
form.
yeah, and there are a lot of ways to benchmark, right? Like in terms of extracurricular commitments, in terms of your grades, your classes, in terms of like overall standing or whatever. But yeah, there's just so many ways to do it. And I think as life becomes more complicated and there are more circumstances, it gets harder and harder to benchmark yourself against others. And like, I don't know, I have found myself thinking a lot recently about the freedom and that like kind of unencumberedness that comes with the fact that a lot of where I am right now is not that is not that easy to benchmark against others. And versus I think even up until I came to China, so much was like you could just look across to your peers.
Benchmarkable, if
It's
that's the word.
marketable. Yeah. So I think on one hand, it was like when I was in the US, I was still mostly hanging out with people who in many ways are kind of definable in similar terms to me, right? Like most of the people I hung out with were people I went to college with. And most people kind of were moving, like in terms of things that I was benchmarking, it was like, when do you move cities? Like, when do you move in with your partner? When do you get engaged? Like, when do you switch jobs? Like, at what level are you in a job, right? Like, all of these things, I was like kind of looking across. Sorry, what's your salary? I think is another really big one that people think about. And then now, and I think a lot of it happened when I came to China, but everything kind of got thrown out, and the group of people I was accustomed to benchmarking myself against has really changed. It's diversified. And so, like, on a personal level, it's like I'm closer to my family than I ever was, but almost like whenever you get close to your parents, especially, like, there's this transition between being a child and like kind of increasingly becoming their parent, but even if not becoming their parent, being a peer, right? And then Chinese or like Asian expectations are so different from Western expectations that I couldn't compare to my friends' relationships with their parents back home anyway, because it's just really, really different. And if I compare my relationship to my peers in China, it's also so different, right? Like in China, like people at my age right now are typically dealing with the 上有老下有小 problem, or like you are basically living with your parents and taking care of them, and also living with your own children at this point and taking care of them. And like that's a really stressful experience, and also not at all what mine is. Like my dad has Alzheimer's for sure, but I am able to distance myself from those expectations being an American. But then in my personal life as well, right? Like I got divorced, and then like starting to date again when you're kind of 29, 30 is like a really weird thing, and you don't know what your self-worth is. You don't even know like what is good on the market type of thing. And then you really have strange expectations. I walked out of a 8.5, 9 year relationship. And so you also have different expectations for relationships. And like before, a lot of people have this experience when they've dated someone for a long time or have families, is like you hang out with couple friends, right? And so your friend group actually also has to shift, like the people that, because it's not that couples won't hang out with single people, but it's just like it's a little different, right? And then families increasingly are a lot of people who I'm friends with as well. And then like being anti Stephenie and then not having that like in my life and in my zone, in terms of like what I benchmark to. And then work. In terms of being an entrepreneur, I have a lot of cushion for trying something new and starting fresh. Like, I don't carry debt, and I actually just am very lucky to have family support as well. So in many ways, I have a little bit of a buffer, but at the same time, like before in the US, I didn't have to compare myself to other companies, right? Because like kind of the owners of our business were in charge of comparing at bigger scale how we were doing. I compared myself maybe like my work performance based on the goals that we set, but then also across to like other similar type of businesses in that region or that in that area, so to speak. And then when I was at VIP Kid, like so it's an ed tech company, and ed tech was really hot. There are actually so many companies that you can compare yourself with, and analysts are constantly producing reports that help like how many monthly active users there are, or and then how many classes are being consumed, what the refund rate is, what the renewal rate is, like blah, blah, blah. Like across all of these vectors, you have really hard data to do this kind of comparison. And then when I was running a business unit or a product line in VIP Kit as well, like we could compare across business units and product line, right? Like how a product is actually doing. You can also compare on numbers like your revenue or your margins, et cetera, et cetera. Now, when you're doing your own thing, it's like you can do competitors analysis, right? Like, and we do our due diligence. So we went out and we asked like similar companies how they're doing and things like that. But like our space is actually just a slow moving service-based space. And the margins are pretty good. And so there's not a ton of like pressure from a survival perspective. There's not a ton of pressure from a competitor's perspective. So it's really just like us and our desire to do good and
Mm-hmm.
the KPIs and goals we set for ourselves. So it makes it so that like at any given time, if you underperform your expectations, you can be generous with yourself. So you don't have to kill yourself in order to survive. But it's also like if you don't compel yourself to set audacious goals and to reflect actively and to recognize that you could be doing more, you could stall, right? And you can stop. And so, like, I think in many ways, in many of these like parts of my life, I am now living a product of like the decisions that I've made that have continually made it so I have fewer benchmarks that I can like compare myself to. And sometimes it's liberating, right? Sometimes it's like, oh, thank God I don't have to like look at other people and like figure it out. Sometimes it's really hard because sometimes when I try to benchmark against other people, I just want to know how I'm doing, right? Like, I just want to know if I ought to feel like poo or if I ought to feel great. Like, if this feeling confident is has a backbone. It's difficult, and then you have to like really kind of minutely take apart what you're trying to achieve and then tackle it and try to self-assess. Um, yeah, so I think that's like how I feel, or like one of the big lessons that has come from making decisions that I think have like brought me to diverge more and more from what I used to compare myself to, and then to surround myself more and more with people who are actually quite different from the people that I used to compare myself to, and or like the environments or the reference points that I used to compare myself to.
Are you are you comfortable with the way things are now? Are you actively looking to change that somehow? Like, where are you at right now with all of it?
It like fluctuates from day to day, you know? I mean, like, yeah, it fluctuates. For example, when I talk to parents um, about what we do, and or talk to kids, the parents of the kids that we serve, it's just like, there is nothing else on this planet that I would rather do. And I don't want to be constrained by any school or any, organization by how we do what we do because by God, we're doing something really meaningful and it's working. And like, I know that in China, the service doesn't exist elsewhere,
Mm-hmm.
right? So like
So the
sometimes,
highs are really high. They're really fulfilling. Yeah.
yeah. Or like I am more fit than I've ever been. And it's the flexibility of the schedule that affords that, right? Like I can work out really consistently. I can go get acupuncture and like, chiropractic massages. And I can, yeah. So then I'm like, way to be a healthier, better human. Or sometimes I spend like I see how fragile my dad is in particular, and I'm so grateful that I have the flexibility to be able to spend more time with him, and I'm just like, this was the right thing. Like if I was still in the US, we would still have a time zone difference. It would be so hard for me to be closer to them in this like really pivotal period in their life. Or my relationship with my brother, like we're so close. It wouldn't be like that at all. There's so many reasons for me to be so grateful about that, even though it's weird. Like we're probably the closest siblings that I know, and in terms of our relationship, and like a lot of people are like, that's weird, but I'm so grateful for that, right? Um, yeah, I don't know. So like there's so many moments when I can feel that. And then there are obviously moments I was sharing with you before about how I think of my life in like four quadrants, about of work, family, personal relationships, and then my fitness and health. And I think uh, this conversation is happening at a time where more of those pieces feel more unstable and less in control. And so it's a general period of feeling quite a bit more insecure and unsure, quite a bit more self-doubt and like disappointment, than other times in my life. But having experienced these periods before, and then having come out of it, I know I will. It's just, yeah. And then the other thing that I do now is I try to really figure out whether or not my goals are a true reflection of what I want. So what I mean by this is like, I had this conversation with my aunt the other day where she was like, oh, you should get married, find a partner, get married and have a baby. And then most of society bundles that, right? Like find a partner, get married, and then have a baby. And for me, like I'm now thinking about that with a lot of unbundling. Like I'm now thinking about that as like, which one of these do I actually want? Like, do I want partnership? And like, what about partnership do I want? Do I want companionship? Do I want support when I'm going through hard times? Do I feel like I'm someone who processes my emotions and my thoughts and like orally, so I need like a talking partner? Like, what about partnership? Marriage, like, what do I want from that? Like, a lot of people, like, not to stereotype, but like want a car and a house, right? Like, or whatever. But, what about marriage is compelling to me? Is it like this idea of a really long-term commitment? Is it the financial stability? Is it like the legal stability? Is it just social acceptance? Like, I don't know. And then having a kid, like, what about that do I want? Like, is it because I work with kids and so I actually want, from kind of like a weird scientific perspective, to see a kid grow up close and personal, because it's literally like my life's work and passion. Or is it because like I am scared about the future and like I feel like, knowing the way that my brother and I support our parents, like I want to make sure I have that myself when I age. Is it because I, dot, 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 right? Like I do love kids. Like I love kids. So yeah. And I love having a dog. I know it's not the same thing at all, but I love it. And so, yeah. And then so like, if I unbundle these to figure out what I truly want, and then I can say like, how do I solve that problem, right? Like, and the challenge is it's like so much more bandwidth to try to live life this way, right? Like something is just like, like there's a reason why this is the mainstream solution. It's just easier. Like, why can't you just do that? But I mean, I think I'm at a point in my life where I do have to think about unbundling so that I make sure I get the things that have time constraints on it done. And so that I don't like not have the opportunities or the experiences or the sense of safety and security that I want, right? But yeah, I think I feel clear-headed when I make these decisions, but the process is not linear and you go back and forth a lot. And like I usually try to give myself several months of time of feeling like this is the right choice for me before stepping into it, because then I usually try to also talk to people and like make sure I'm not crazy, right? And a lot of times I find people are thinking about similar things. And then I parse through ones like opinions that people have that are maybe more anchored in societal expectations versus the ones where I feel like there's been quite a bit of thought behind how you feel about X, Y, and Z. And so like, this is a concern or this is like a reason to do something that I hadn't thought about before, and helps to make my own decision making a little bit more robust. But it's hard because it really takes a lot of mental space. And it means that like from having an idea to actually executing it takes a little longer. And, sometimes that makes me feel like I'm not moving forward, right?
It's really tough. I find this very relatable I think finding the balance between the intellectual ways to reasons to do something versus just doing it is always so tough for me. It's always a battle. Like I was telling you also that in terms of my job or what I do as on a full-time basis, it's gotten a lot busier and I used to have so much more time to journal and think about stuff. But in a weird way, I kind of like what I'm doing now, where I'm just forced into situations a lot and I don't have that much time to reflect. Because sometimes I feel like maybe I was doing too much reflection and it's different for everybody. But I felt like maybe if I could put a percentage on it, I used to be like 60% reflection. Now I'm like 10% reflection or 20% reflection. And it's not necessarily bad. I feel like there are situations where like the world thrusts things on us, but it doesn't actually. It's not actually a bad thing. It's just a discomfort with that shift. You know what I mean? So yeah.
Totally. I mean, so much of it is managing the discomfort of change. Um, and then I think sometimes when you have practice managing it, or you have practice doing reflecting, like when you are in a situation where you have to be more decisive or there are more time constraints basically and you have to move more quickly, your framework is more like deeply understood by you and practiced, so you can actually be more decisive in a more thoughtful way than maybe your peers. um, I'll say that like uh, for me, I did a Vipassana retreat, those 10 days silent meditations, when I was in Taiwan about 3 years ago. And I think I realized at that point how much reflection I had done that was so guided that it felt like it was like checkbox type of reflection.
Mm,
Was using
mm.
like journals or like I was using guided meditations leading up to it, or I was like doing these things, and they all have like a voice or literally text that guides you in how to reflect. But some things are just personal. And like some things like I think you need to really sit with to kind of notice the inconsistencies in your own thought or like the real leanings in your own thought to have like that self-awareness. And now I unfortunately don't meditate as much anymore, but I found that I can enter a meditative state more quickly, right? I can get into that place where I'm present with myself and I'm noticing without judgment, or noticing with judgment and noticing that I'm noticing with judgment without judgment. Like, and I can do all those things much more easily. And like those meditative periods really help me to then be able to more effectively like anchor the rest of what's going on, like to, because it helps me zoom out and kind of just notice, is that important or is that not important? Like, is that something that I'm just procrastinating on? Like, is that something that I need to be spending this amount of energy on, et cetera, et cetera. So um and that's not what I do while I meditate, but somehow after I meditate, I tend to have more clarity, and like I tend to be in myself rather than preoccupied by like the noisy client, right? Or like the really stressful employee, or the, you know, relationship that's not going well, or the demands that my family's levying on me, or whatever else, right?
Would you recommend that retreat for others? The hardcore one that you did, that you just mentioned? No
Yes.
technology, right? You're just asked to just sit there with your thoughts and that's it.
No technology, no books, no writing. It's just meditation. You wake up at 4 a.m. for your first meditation. You have breakfast, you meditate again. They're like maybe 2 or 3 sessions. And then you have lunch, and then you meditate for like 2 sessions. And then you have like a soup or like a apple for dinner. And then you
Okay.
meditate again. And then you go to bed. And you do it all over again for 10 days.
That sounds very scary. So it's just sustenance, and you being in a cave of sorts, like a metaphorical cave.
Yeah. So I don't, I'm happy to talk about my own experience, but I find that everybody's experience is actually quite different. Like
Has to
I've
be.
talked to people who come out realizing that they've never loved themselves, like that they've like kind of hated themselves all their lives. I've like talked to people who come out of it really like finding themselves perpetuating things in their own relationships. You know, I've know people who walk out of it seeing their own hypocrisies and things, finding and recognizing their purpose in things. Like for me, I'll talk about two quick things. One of them was like, I didn't realize I cared about our environment and like our carbon footprint and things like that until I did this. But like, it actually really strangely consumed a lot of my thoughts while I was there. I don't even know why, right? Like, it might be that you can't like talk to anyone or do anything, and like you basically walk in this courtyard, and our courtyard was really janky. Like, it was just like a really old, broken down basketball court with like just wild plants kind of growing. And then you look at the moon, you look at the plants, and you know, sometimes you lie on a bench and you look up at the trees. Like, it might be something like that. I don't know. But I actually spent hours like thinking about like, my God, like I am just destroying the world in the way that I live. And like, I wish I had the expertise and know how to do something about that. And yeah, so that was one thing. And it was so unexpected. And then the second thing was like, I thought I dealt with my really complicated feelings about my divorce. I thought I dealt with it because it was like a year or 2 years before. And I like had moved on in my life in many ways, but I just really hadn't. And the things that you haven't dealt with, I think can really punch you in the stomach when you have nothing except for your own thoughts. Um, so I would say those are like two things that were really unexpected for me. Um, yeah.
All right. Well, on that note, Stephanie, it's really good to have a conversation with you today. Um, Ending on a very like introspective point, I guess.
Everyone
Yeah,
should do
it's just
it. It's so good. And it's free. Did I say that? It's free. It's by donation.
oh, it's by donation. Okay. Yeah. I mean, the biggest thing is I assume the biggest thing was really your time and your own commitment, right? That's the thing that's not free, but or it
Can I
is,
make
in it,
a point?
depending how you
Can I
look
make
at it.
a point on that? People who run the Vipassana workshops and like it is it's not religious, like it's not Buddhist, but obviously meditation is oftentimes closely linked to Buddhism. So I talked to a couple of Buddhists after the retreat, and what they say about it and what I really like in what they say is when the time is right, there will be an opening for Vipassana in a place that you want to be, and you will have the time for it. So when it's right for you. Um, and like, I also am someone who, with my workaholic tendencies, like always feel like there's no time. But it was truly like in Taiwan when it was completely booked back to back, there was a slot that I was able to get. And it was 10 days, like right before it, or like right after, and then with a break between the next big initiative we were doing for work. And even, yeah, so it was just like, it'll be a confluence of factors. Yeah.
Okay, I have to ask. This is the last question I have to ask. What was it like to come out of that 10-day
It's,
retreat?
it's weird. Um, so
It
on a
must be,
micro,
right? In addition to just a lot of unread messages and whatnot, but just the general, what is it? What is
oh,
it?
yeah,
What's your
if you
mind at, you know?
chat, you should like back it up or something because you'll lose days of messages. Like, I think maybe if you don't read like 2,000 messages or something, WeChat stops bringing it in or something like that. Anyway, I definitely lost messages. People will be like, I messaged you about this. And I was like, oh, sorry, I was on a Vipassana retreat and I think my phone just didn't do it. But yeah, there are a ton of messages. But one of the best things was like I just didn't touch my phone, like I just could do hours and hours without touching my phone, and it didn't feel weird at all. Um, yeah. And when messages responded or came in, I like just kind of would be like, maybe being present in what I'm doing right now is better and more urgent, and or like a better use of my time. So I thought that was really nice. Just the sound of voices is really weird after 10 days of silence. Um, you're also there with like all these people that you sit with and like live with, right, for 10 days. And you finally hear their voices. Like you finally figure out who they are as humans. I don't know if other people do this, but I spent days like I had full stories in my brain about the person who was next to me. Like I thought she, was part of like a Japanese yakuza, and like some had just recently lost someone in a gang fight, and like blah blah blah. And she was a photographer who scuba dives, and like basically meditation can help you lengthen your breath. And so someone was like, oh, you should do this. And then she was like, yeah, sure. And like, didn't know that it was a 10-day fully silent retreat type of thing. But like, so you'll like have these kind of interesting things that happen in your brain. Voices are really weird. You just are so disconnected. You feel like things are moving really fast, but you kind of don't mind, right? Like, it's not like, I think sometimes when we're in the world too often, again, that benchmarking thing, you're like, oh, everybody's moving so fast, should I? Like I went back to Taipei, which isn't the fastest city on this planet, but like everybody was obviously moving faster than I was at that point. And I was just like, cool, like observing and noticing. And it was great.
Yeah, letting things be. Thank you, Stephenie, so much. And thank you so much. And we'll hopefully talk again soon. Maybe check in after a little bit of more time has elapsed, I hope.
Yeah. Yeah. So much going on. But yeah, thanks for having me. This was really fun and very casual and really easy to do.
Thanks for listening to The Why with James Hsu. To support the show, please leave a rating on your favorite podcasting app, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or any platform really. It helps spread the word and tell others that you enjoy my work. Same goes for YouTube. If you're watching this on YouTube, please subscribe and leave a comment. That helps get the word out and goes a long way. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll catch you next time.